rates, not just the one-time issue of where we are now. It's the lowering of that line to what we can reasonably expect over the next 2 or 3 years. So that's why the difference in our treatment of these issues compared to this time last spring. We believe it will be, again, it'll be the end of 12 before we see those fiscal year 8 levels. So that's about a 4-year window of time to get back to where we were 4 years ago. So this is what we're proposing in terms of expenditures. The square is what we would be dealing with without any cuts if we continued appropriations at the current level. And the diamond shape reflects the proposed 20% cut to the discretionary pool of expenditures. So you see there that our intention is to, again, in fiscal year 11, use some of that accumulated reserve and a smaller amount in fiscal year 12 to bring the fund in balance sometime 12-13 fiscal year range. So the difference in that level of reduction is to bring it closer to being in balance, not necessarily fully in balance next year, but in balance going forward. Let me see. Why do we not propose using additional fund balance in the current year? Why do we think it's necessary to make these cuts? Well, our fund balance is there for a very specific set of purposes. The first is it provides assurance and evidence to our creditors that we can meet our obligations and that we are essentially very minimal credit risk to enter into these multi-year obligations with. That is important because that determines our future cost of finance capital projects. In other words, our history stays with us in that regard, and we believe we want to continue to keep the future costs of capital projects as low as we can by having that high assurance of ability to meet our obligations. We also have cash flow considerations, as you know. The third point is we need to preserve flexibility for you all because as we all know, we don't know what opportunities could present themselves going forward. So those three combine to say we want to be sensitive to what level of fund balance we maintain going forward. Staff's recommendation, if projections hold, would take us to a low point at the end of fiscal year 12 of $320,000 in reserve in this fund. And that was a big factor in what determined the level of discretionary expenditure reduction we recommended to you. That is lower than we would ever like, but it is appropriate given the fact that one of the purposes of reserve fund is a rainy day fund. And it's clearly indicated it's raining when it comes to the revenue that we're receiving from the hospitality tax. So some usage of that is appropriate, but balanced by those other concerns that we think $320,000 is an appropriate floor to shape our decisions around. So our recommendation is as follows. We did receive, in addition to the 23 line items that are in the current year's budget, for next year, we received 4 additional requests. We just as a basis for beginning discussion, we did not include those in the projected expenditures for next year. Those 4 new requests, and we think our situation is such that it would be wise not to entertain new requests through fiscal year 13. Second aspect of it is we think it's necessary to reduce next fiscal year 2010 to 2011 funding by 20% across that basket of discretionary expenditures to achieve a expenditure reduction of $123,000. And the third is to establish here, sort of by matter of discussion, not a formal action of council, but it's establish the intention and expectation to hold that discretionary pool at that reduced level through fiscal year 12 and 13, unless we are surprised at the rate of revenue recovery, unless it exceeds what we think is historic benchmark for our fund. And that's important because that's the piece that allows us to have that look ahead that's in balance that we think is necessary and appropriate given where we are. So this is a chart showing that projection through next year, which is fiscal year 11, the subsequent year, fiscal year 12, and then the proposed projection there for fiscal year 13. Of note is that the city's commitment to the Chapman Cultural Center will be complete in fiscal year 12, which will allow us to begin restoring that fund balance that we're drawing down in the 2 years prior. So that would show us taking that fund balance to a low of $320,000, but the ability to begin building it back in fiscal year 13, or entertaining those discussions that y'all would want to have at that time about what to do going forward. And that projection is there in here.
So how much is our obligation to the chapter percent of?
That is a 10-year commitment of $200,000 a year, summing to $2 million. And we have essentially two annual payments remaining, one next year and one in fiscal year 12. And this shows that if that level of $123,000 reduction was applied in an across-the-board manner, what would that mean to the individual efforts or organizations contained in the current year's budget? You see those amounts laid out there. This is in your packets and available. So again, that's where we are, and that's what we think is necessary to take these steps. We're glad to answer any questions about how we got to this point and what we need to do going forward. As you'll notice, we have no discussion or information to offer about any of the requests we did receive. We of course have that information. We'll make it available to you. Very compelling requests, very effective programs across the board. None of this has to do with any disappointment or any relationship to the good work being done by those organizations. Simply a function of the revenue available, but you will have opportunities to review their requests in detail. Any questions?
Anyone have any questions?
So you said we won't be taking on.
I was just wondering, could you give some information about legally how the hospitality money has to be spent? What does it have to be spent on? I mean, I know I probably should know this.
Sure. Things that we conclude collectively are likely to generate visits to the city that meet the state definition of tourism. And that's why you see a lot of activities and events that bring people into town, and that's the statutory restriction. The activities that relate to that.
Is there a certain radius of how far they have to come from, or in terms of visits?
That's not explicitly uniformly enforced. I mean, 50 miles is a benchmark for some of the parts of the definition, but the volume, for instance, let's say the events and activities that take place in downtown on Morgan Square in the typical springtime, we won't have absolute knowledge of who's coming from what distance, but we can reasonably conclude that folks are coming from out of town from that. That's the key distinction.
Councilman Reader?
I know we're taking on red, white, and green just this year. We're gonna look at it next year. Do you see any foresight that we'll be able to sustain red, white, and green?
The event staff is optimistic that we can have a very successful, very well-received event for the level of appropriation that exists in this year. Now, of course, they haven't had an opportunity to react to this particular presentation as none of the other requesters have, but we know that there will be some impacts, of course, and some events will have to be reduced in scope, and programs will have to be reduced to some degree to meet that level of reduction. But we believe the event can go forward. Yes, sir.
Any other questions?